Evening, everybody, and welcome to our fifth installment of the One Book, One Community program. So my name is Sandy Towers. I'm the interim director here at Williamsburg Regional Library, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight. So Williamsburg Regional Library, with generous support from the Friends of the Williamsburg Regional Library Foundation, our president of the foundation is with us tonight. Thank you, Randy. And William and Mary Libraries, and we have them represented here tonight as well. We are pleased to host tonight's event. We started this program 5 years ago in hopes that the community would enjoy a shared reading experience about a socially relevant topic. We've enjoyed discussions about urban Native Americans, Black history, shared spaces, and immigration. This year's selection, The Displacements, by our special guest, Bruce Holsinger, has sparked thoughtful discussions on the impact of a changing climate and how we can care for our community now and into the future. Tonight, we'll hear more about the book, how it came about, and some of its central themes. WRL Readers Advisory Librarian Andrew Smith, who was walking around here earlier interviewing unsuspected people with the microphone, he will be leading the discussion and will also reserve some time at the end so you can join in the conversation. So without any delay, let me welcome Tammy Back, the Director of Communications at William and Mary Libraries, who will be introducing our special guest for this evening.
Hello. Thanks for coming out today, this beautiful day that we have. So yes, I'm here to introduce Bruce, and I will go over his little bio, but I have kind of a funny story that I wanted to share. So I met Bruce at the Library of Virginia Literary Awards in October, and I didn't recognize him. And so we're chit-chatting and we're just talking, and I'm like, oh, I work at William & Mary. Where do you work? We're just having, nice conversation. He was so kind. But it wasn't until later in the evening when they announced the finalists that I realized he was Bruce Holsinger, the Bruce that I was talking to, and he was one of the finalists. So he just let me blabber on, about all of the books, the wonderful books, and all the authors, and he was one of them. And he never said yeah, that's me, I'm that Bruce. So that was the way we met. And I knew after reading the book that we had to choose this book for One Book, One Community. I hope you all enjoyed it as well. Okay, so Bruce Holsinger is the author of 4 novels, including The Displacements and The Gift at School, and many works of nonfiction, most recently On Parchment, Animals, Archives, and the Making of Culture from Herodotus to the Digital Age. His books have been recognized with the Colorado Book Award, the John Hurt Fisher Prize, the Philip Brett Award, the John Nicholas Brown Prize, the Modern Language Association's Prize for First Book, and others. He has written for the New York Times, Vanity Fair, and many other publications, and has been interviewed on NPR's Weekend Edition, Here and Now, and Marketplace. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. He teaches in the Department of English at the University of Virginia. We'll forgive him for that since, I'm from William and Mary, where he specializes in medieval literature and modern critical thought and serves as editor of the quarterly journal, New Literary History. So with that, I welcome Bruce and Andrew to the stage.
Wonderful.
I'm not sure which of us is bringing the extra sound.
I might be the feedback guy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Tammy, I do have to, before we start, say that Bruce does have a connection to William and Mary. His son played varsity soccer.
Just graduated a couple years ago. And my sister went here too.
So
it's not all evil.
That's right. Yeah. We can claim
Yeah. But thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. And thank you all so much for coming. And you for being here.
Well, it's my pleasure. I read and enjoyed the book. Have not talked to anybody who has been less than full of praise for it. But it's struck me as something different than ordinary. You had an academic career. What made you decide to take the leap into writing fiction and historical mysteries?
Yeah. So this happened a long, long time ago. My first job was at the University of Colorado in Boulder, where I moved years and years ago after finishing my graduate work in New York. And I was, my wife moved to Wisconsin, and I had this long year where I was living alone, really for the first time. And I had been an avid reader of thrillers all my life. I thought, I'm going to write a thriller this year. So I wrote a thriller, and it was awful. It had sentences in it like, the mashed potatoes were as fluffy as clouds, that kind of thing. It was a kind of contemporary techno thriller with a medieval background. I couldn't get an agent for it, never published it, tried again, same thing happened. Then probably about 15 years ago, I finally wrote something that ended up getting me an agent who also could not place that book. But she did talk me into writing a novel set in the period that I study. I've studied and taught the Middle Ages, the European medieval literature for many, many years. And that was a burnable book, my first novel. And that did get published. And then after that, I wrote another historical thriller called The Invention of Fire. Right. And then these last two novels, The Gifted School and The Displacements, are contemporary family dramas with dark twists. And so I guess what really started me doing it was just these different lobes of my brain demanding different kinds of writing. It's a different part of me that writes fiction versus academic writing.
Did you have any trouble convincing your agent to make that leap into modern literature with that dark setting when the time came? Because you'd had two successful medieval books, the John Gower books.
Yeah, I think part of it is, I guess burnout is a wrong word, but I'm a bit of a hummingbird in what I do with my writing, and I didn't want to keep going. It turned out, honestly, the inside baseball story is that I hadn't realized that for my second novel, I had to write a novel with the same protagonist as the first one. I didn't quite understand that my editor at HarperCollins was thinking of this as a series. And so after I turned the first one in, we had this conversation, and she said, so what's the second John Gower novel about? And I said, what do you mean the second John Gower novel? I just didn't understand. So I went back and read my contract, which I should have done before signing. And sure enough, so I wrote it. And after that, I didn't want to be stuck in a rut of writing the John Gower series for the rest of my life. So I ended up kind of backing away and from that editor and that publisher, and then went with a different imprint for The Gifted School. And it was, I haven't looked back. I don't regret that.
Well, so when the Gifted School came out, it was about the same time as the Varsity Blues Ivy League admissions scandal, which some reviewers credited you with predicting with the book. And so I'm wondering, do you have any predictions that we should know about with The Displacements?
No, I don't think I want to make any predictions, but it's, that was a great story. And in fact, the first I heard about this it would have been probably the spring of 2019, right? Yeah. And the advanced readers copies of The Gifted School are going around. That's the novel before The Displacements. And so they're going around. ARCs are these kind of thick paperbacks that your publicist sends out to reviewers, to newspapers, to the trade magazines, and to generate advance buzz and to get, to see if they can score reviews for you. And so they had just gone out, I think in March of that year, and I got an email from my father-in-law that says, Bruce, this is your book. And I clicked the link, and it's the link to the New York Times story with Felicity Huffman on the cover, on the main photo. And I thought, oh my God, that's about college admissions. This is about competitive parents trying to get their kids into a magnet school. An hour later, I get a call from my editor, and we get on a conference call, and suddenly it was just kind of crazy. So the Wall Street Journal, what you were referring to, called it the novel that predicted the college admission scandal. So it slotted me into this bizarre role of kind of the Cassandra of various things involving privileged white people. And that is, I guess that partly it's also more seriously that I was not thinking about that at all when I started the Displacements years ago. But this is a novel about climate displacement and about internal catastrophe in the United States. And I shudder to think of this having predictive force. But in many ways, it may. It's not my prediction. It's everyone's prediction. So.
Well, would you mind reading some from it?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the passage that I'll read just for a few minutes comes, I don't know how many of you have read the book, but it involves this family, this very affluent family, seemingly affluent family living in Coral Gables, Florida, a part of Miami. And they are, what happens at the beginning of the book is the world's first Category 6 hurricane, something else that's been in the news lately, is about to strike South Florida. It takes an unpredictable swerve out in the Caribbean, is about to strike South Florida. And this woman, Daphne, she's an artist. Her husband, Brantley, he's a surgeon, and their 3 children. They have to evacuate. Brantley, the husband, he's a surgeon, so he has to go evacuate the hospital where he works in downtown Miami, while Daphne and the kids get in the family minivan, start the Odyssey, and get out of Dodge. And
literally an Odyssey, wasn't it?
Yes, in some ways it is. But that's one of Daphne's lines early on to Alexa: "Start the Odyssey," which means start the minivan, but start the Odyssey for this family. But something very unfortunate happens to them, just by you learn why later, which is that Daphne's purse has been left behind and she's only traveling with her kids. So with all her credit cards, with her iPad, with everything. So you think, like in a normal circumstance, I forgot my purse, forgot my phone, whatever. But when 6 million people are evacuating South Florida, and all they have is their cars and their phones, things can get pretty dire. So the family runs out of gas. As it were, the car runs out of gas, and Daphne is she just found out that the purse is gone. She's just getting mad at her stepson, and then she's faced with the dilemma of this empty tank, and what is she going to do? And I just want you to picture her. She's an artist, very affluent, living in a gorgeous house on the water in South Florida, and here she is. She takes the phone from Gavin, her stepson, and enters a remembered password. When that doesn't work, she tries another she's used, then a third. She gets a warning, tries an old password. Too many attempts, the screen shows. Damn it, she tears up. I think I'm locked out. From the edge of the parking lot, she watches a perky blonde woman swipe a credit card at a gas pump. The contours of Daphne's life ripple in the heat, these webs of connection that might be drawn upon at a moment like this. No parents, no siblings, and her phoneless mother-in-law is on a bus to God knows where. Brantley has a cousin in Idaho he's talked to maybe twice in 10 years. Pilar and her husband are evacuating right now, just like Daphne's family. The few other people she knows in Miami are all scattered to the winds, and why would they help her when they have their own families to attend to? Her life is built on her art, her routines, her credit cards, her iPhone contact list, on the stability of nuclear family and dependable technology. Now there is no one to call, no way to call. And yet, in this moment, her children are hungry. The blonde woman strolls back toward the convenience store, an oval face smug with a full tank of gas, a working credit card. She has everything. Daphne approaches her. Excuse me, can I ask you something? Of course, she says, returning Daphne's smile. Daphne explains the situation, the evacuation, the abandoned purse. The woman's name is Shelley from Fort Lauderdale. They're all heading up to her sister's place in Savannah to wait it out. The husband comes out with their 2 daughters, who veer off toward the car as he walks up and gives Daphne a once-over through his aviators. So I guess what I'm asking, Daphne says, wincing, is whether you can help us. I need to feed my kids, and I was hoping you might loan us some cash. The husband crosses his arms. The convenience store bag dangles from his fingers. I'm not comfortable with that. Shelley elbows him. Don't be an ass. Her husband is a surgeon at UMed. Oh, he still looks suspicious. Shelley pulls out a wallet. Take a 20, take 2, seriously, and don't even think of trying to pay us back. Just pay it forward to someone. She pushes the bills into Daphne's hands. Thank you. Only $40, but her knees almost buckle. Thank you so, so much. And good luck to you guys. Yeah, good luck, the husband says, already turning his wife away, and the couple walk together back to their fully gassed up Subaru, where they hand out snacks and drinks to the 2 girls leaning against the hatchback playing on their phones. Why did you give that lady money, Mommy? One of them asks. Shelley throws a chagrined smile back at Daphne. We were just helping her family, sweetie. We all need help sometimes. Daphne walks numbly back toward the kids. Mia, eyes closed, leans against a tree trunk with her head lolling to the side. Oliver draws lines with his toe in the dirt. Only Gavin has witnessed the exchange. When she looks at him, he smirks. Daphne the beggar. Something detonates in her skull. She steps up until her face is inches from her stepson's. Don't you say a word, slamming a finger into his bony chest. You're the one who left my purse in the driveway. You're the reason we're in this whole situation in the first place. You are so ungrateful, Gavin, so irresponsible. An awful silence rings in her ears. Oliver gapes. Mia, awakened by her mother's volume, starts to cry. Gavin turns away and the shame comes crashing in. She has never spoken to him like this, not even close. Customers stare over at her family from the pumps and from the entrance to the convenience store. Shelley is just pulling out, windows open as the Subaru inches forward in the exit line. The husband has his elbow out. He looks right at Daphne and she glimpses herself as he goes by. Her hungry family, a distortion in his mirrored shades. All right.
Thank you.
So let me quickly frame that passage if it's okay. So, one of the things that we know about climate change, and one of the things that I grappled with when I was writing this novel, is the disproportionate effects that climate change is already having, climate dispossession and displacement are already having on disadvantaged populations, on the world's poor, vastly more on people of color than privileged white people like this family, like my family. But one of the reasons I wrote this book is to think about climate change and the narrative and emotional effects on climate change across socioeconomic strata. So I'm not unaware of that sociological issue, I guess you'd call it. But I wanted to think about that problem from the point of view of your modern affluent family, and to think about what these forces look like. After this incident, Daphne and her family, they don't have anything. They end up going to a huge displacement mega shelter in Oklahoma with 10,000 other people from South Florida, from Houston, where the hurricane hits. And it's just about what her family goes through in the months that they're there. That's a large part of what the novel traces.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks. You just killed my next question.
Oh, good. There you go. Always happy to kill a question.
So we read this book as part of our One Book, One Community program. What is your idea of community, and how did you want to show that, or did you show that in the Displacements?
Yeah, that is such a great question. One of the books that inspired me when I was writing this, you all know the writer Rebecca Solnit. She writes all kinds of books, a beautiful book called Orwell's Roses, many others. But the book that really moved me was called A Paradise Built in Hell. And it's about resilience in community in the aftermath of catastrophe. And one of her arguments is that, or one of the subjects of the book, are these provisional communities that people put together, even in the face of really grim catastrophes. So she looks at, for example, the Great San Francisco earthquake / fire of what it was in 1903, and the way that the people of San Francisco kind of pulled together and helped each other and didn't just look out for themselves. As Solnit says, there's a way we think about catastrophe, just people, when you lose everything, you just turn against each other and so on. But she says that's really not true, and that there's ways that people form these provisional communities. And the displacement camp, the big mega shelter in Oklahoma that I imagine in this book, that's really the case. People are helping each other, they're being friendly to each other. Now, of course, there's always a dark side, and where would suspense be without that? And so there are some people who don't want to be in this community, or some people who are violating its norms. But I really wanted to think about that, about how it's not just populations being scattered to the wind. It's also people pulling together and working together in really unimaginable ways, but ways that become really familiar to them as the story goes on.
Were there specific examples in the book that you thought of as being the best of community, specifics that you thought of as being a failure of community?
Yeah. Oh, you're asking such great questions. Well, so the ideal kind of constellation of community I think in the displacement shelter happens in the library. So library is right at the center of the book. And this kid, Gavin, so Gavin is a sad sack. He had to drop out of Stanford several months before this book started. We don't quite know why he dropped out, but he dropped out. So he's along on the evacuation, really disgruntled, and ends up, he's in the library, and he thinks, he's just dealing with this disaster. His dad has just died, you learn very early on, and he is paging through these books at the library, and he finds this book by Emerson, Essays of Emerson, that's very important to him. And he starts reading, and he thinks of his dad, and he's just down. But then he starts working in the library. He starts volunteering there, and he becomes kind of the mega shelter librarian. And he starts reading to kids, and he starts finding a new kind of path, a new appreciation, pulling himself out of the muck, out of the mud, and literally out of the mud, and becoming important to people in a way he never has been. Now, that also has a dark side, because as it happens, as anybody read it and knows what happens, and what also Gavin starts doing in that library. So you'll see if you read it, but that becomes both a source of resilience for him and a source of criminality, and a resource for both. So I really like to. It took me a long time more time to imagine this book than to read it. I had these graphs up on my wall, these maps of the camp, and what it would look like, and what kinds of things people would need. And I could talk about my research for it if you'd like, but really thinking of the library as a kind of crystallizing location in the camp. Gavin also joins a band called The Displacements, which is the title of the book, which is where the book gets its title.
Now, what was the genesis of the book? And I do want to ask you about your research and your mapping and all that, but where did the original idea spring from?
I'll tell the short version of that story. So it actually started in another book. It was kind of part of another book that was called, that I won't write, but a kind of, not a failed novel, but one that I started and didn't finish. And it was called The Great Flip. And it was about this group of people who moves to Oklahoma, that are displaced to Oklahoma and then move to Oklahoma. And it's about flipping a red state blue. So it's about elections. It's about, moving a bunch of population into, and so it was this weird idealistic book about democracy and so on. And I sent the first, 30,000 words, 100 pages or so to my agent. And she said, this is so sweet. And I can tell, and this is her, I can tell you spend a lot of time on Twitter, on Politico, and it's a great idea for maybe a short story. But the one thing I do really like in here is this hurricane displacement shelter in Oklahoma. That's really interesting. What if you thought about that? I thought, okay. But a year later, I'm working on this. I'm under contract for this. And it just took off. So that was the origin. And often that's the way my novels come to me. I have probably 10 full or parts of novels in the drawer, and I'm always in between writing what gets published. I'm always kind of experimenting and starting new things and trying new ideas. So this came out of a failed idea. So
it worked.
And there's a much long, tortured, convoluted version of that story. But there's no whiskey
too.
up here, so.
Well, you mentioned doing research. Did you have particular, world experiences, geographic ideas, things that you were
Selling
looking
drugs,
at to get? Yeah, well, it's the criminal tendencies.
Yeah,
of
criminal.
us.
My own criminality.
But actually, about when you were envisioning the camp, the shelter, and the guests, did you have something in the back of your mind that was guiding you in the creation of that setting? Yeah,
so I got, when I realized what this was going to be about, internal displacement within the United States, I knew one of the big precedent, obviously, is Hurricane Katrina in recent times. And so I spent a lot of time reading, interviewing, watching things about displacement during Katrina. And one of the big points of argument in that coverage of Katrina was the resistance among those displaced populations to being called refugees, right? They're not refugees, they're not stateless. And the United Nations, other relief organizations there's a really important distinction between IDPs, internally displaced persons, and refugees. IDPs within the boundaries of a nation, refugees across boundaries. And one thing I really learned to my shock, now I no longer find it shocking, is that the United States and most countries have very little law on the books to deal with all the legalities and logistics of internally displaced persons. There's tons of law dealing with refugees, people who come from other places, but not about, especially on this scale. So I really had to imagine, I looked at FEMA, I did a lot of research into FEMA and how FEMA handles internal disasters, how they shelter people, and you would not believe the number of documents. They would easily fill this stage about various aspects of law, policy, and regulation. If you're in FEMA and you want to set up a camp for 600 people, okay, so are they allowed to bring firearms into the camp? The answer is no, according to FEMA. But there's a ton of state law that says people can bring firearms wherever they want in this state, bucko. So I thought, okay, so that's a jurisdiction issue. How are my characters going to deal with that? Sex offenders in displacement shelters. So you empty a jail, or there's known sex offenders living in a neighborhood. Those people get evacuated too. So how do the authorities deal with that when there's a ton of kids running around a camp, right? So it just blew my mind, the number of things that went into those kinds of deliberations and those documents. So I just did massive amounts of reading in government documents. But to get back to your question, there's no way I could imagine this without talking to people who had worked in places like this. So one of my primary resources was a dear friend and colleague of mine at the University of Virginia who teaches in the Batten School. And she teaches courses on disaster relief. She has worked for UNICEF, for Doctors Without Borders, many other relief organizations, and now teaches that. And she goes back all the time to the Sudan and to many other big, huge refugee camps, much bigger than this one. This is only 10,000 people. The biggest refugee camp right now has about 2 million people in it. And so she's worked in those places, and she was a great source of brainstorming for me. I just picked her brain so much. She read the whole manuscript twice, critiqued it, sent it to friends, had other people give me pointers. I visited her class to brainstorm with the students. And then this book was part of a United Nations book club about disaster relief and climate change last year, where we had this forum with people from Sesame Street who are working with refugee children in displacement camps around the world and thinking about programming for children. Children are very important in this book. And those are the kinds of not immersive research, but kind of intensive research that I go through for all my novels. I interviewed meteorologists, hurricane experts, people working on climate change in the Atlantic. Do not recommend talking to those people if you want to sleep at night. So research all over the place.
Yeah. And there were at least 4 topics that came out of just that portion of it. The last one being, don't talk to those people. One of the things that kind of astonished me and explained a lot about young people that I know is the young woman at the Stanford teach-in who says that it's estimated that guys think about sex about every 7 seconds. And she said, for us, it's climate change.
That's what we think about every 7 seconds.
Yeah, that's every 7 seconds.
Yeah, that sentence, when I wrote that sentence just came to me. And I remember it. And I remember I started bawling when I typed it. And that's I can talk about the fun of writing and the art of it and everything, but, it is having kids and just worrying about them and their futures, my own future. It's a grim subject, and it's not like The Gifted School, which is a kind of lightly satirical, kind of dark humor novel, where the stakes are incredibly low for the reader, for the people in the book. You want to get your kid into a great school, right? It's the stakes are very, very high, but in a limited way. But in this case, writing about such a dark, gloomy subject, the key word for this book is resilience. How people find resilience in the face of something like this and the sources of it. For Daphne, the main character, her source of resilience is her art, kind of rediscovering it when she has absolutely nothing, when everything is gone, rediscovering the power and virtue and beauty of art again, and sharing art. But some people don't find those sources of resilience. It's a very dark subject, and you can't pretend otherwise when you're writing about climate change.
Going back to your colleague at UVA, was this the person who was the inspiration for Rain, or?
Kind of, yeah. Kirsten Gelsdorf is her name, and So Rain is a character I loved writing. She's kind of the boss of the camp. She's a kind of an assistant. She's like a disaster specialist who works for Region 4 in FEMA, and she gets tasked to go start one of 18. I think it is, massive displacement camps for people who are being moved out of South Florida and Houston. And she is, she is an Army veteran, but she's also, a deeply experienced relief worker. And one of the interesting things about her is she has this kind of, gets razzed by some of her colleagues because she was once on the cover of, I think it was Time magazine, as a symbol of, the power of disaster relief. And it kind of gets roped into this interracial picture of harmony and so on. But she's also tough as nails and has a really difficult relationship with her daughter. So you see that from her point of view. So I wouldn't say Kirsten was the direct inspiration, but after talking with Kirsten and learning all of this, I said, okay, one of my characters has to be outside this family and has to be one of the relief workers running this place. Because there was a point in the middle of the novel where I thought, wait a minute, do I need to scrap everything and just make this a novel about her and call it Rain? And it's going to be about Rain. And I came very close, but ended up, scripting her into the story. Yeah, the sequel. Yeah, maybe so. Rain 2.
Excuse me. So you mentioned the children as well. You decided to start the book with the very brief chapter about the children playing range, which we didn't have, and still, as far as I know, have no idea what the game is.
The hope is
and
that
how
people
it
will
gets
start
played.
playing it like they play Quidditch. That's the dream.
You can.
So if you could help me with that.
I think this group is a little okay.
I know, yeah.
But why did you decide to start with that? With that, that opening.
So I didn't originally. That opening was probably the last thing that I wrote in the book. And why did I want that? I wanted to pluck a scene out from the middle of the book that would get you right in it. That would, it begins, I suppose that scene is probably set a month or so, a few weeks into the book. The book moves pretty chronologically. This is one exception. It's kind of the prologue, but I don't call it that. But it gets you right on the ground, as it were, literally, right, where these kids are playing a game called Range that they've made up. So those of you who have kids, those of you who were kids, you go into a new place, your parents take you to a place with a bunch of other families with kids your age. What's the first thing the kids start doing? They start playing games together. Well, if they don't have their cell phones anymore, right? The first thing they do is they start playing analog games outside. And my kids grew up just by luck in this very kind of old school neighborhood in Charlottesville. It's a new neighborhood, but it's kind of new urbanist, where the houses are all close together and the kids of all ages just kind of ran around all through the neighborhood. There were like 30 kids between 2 and 12 when we moved there. It was like a kid's utopia, but also a kid's dystopia at the same time, right? And that's, so observing the kind of the anthropology of kids and how they start their own games, how they make their own rules, to me that's fascinating. And I felt like I'd read a lot of climate fiction and didn't get a sense of that, the joy that kids can take even in dire circumstances, right? You find a soccer ball, suddenly you've got 20 kids happy as clams, right? Even if they're in a refugee camp. That's another thing Kirsten helped me see, is the importance of kids. So that's really why I wanted to get down on the ground, kind of follow almost with a camera, of a GoPro almost, these kids as they run around the camp. And I think that, that's part of it. Yeah.
There was also, I'd say, kind of a dark end to the prologue as the buses are coming in and Mia's looking out and she says, here's somebody else coming along to take from me. Yeah. And so I found that to be...
Yeah, where are they even from? And someone asked, and then someone else says, Houston. Houston, right? Like we're from Florida, but they're from Houston. And, it's 1,000 more IDPs. And now they can't use these empty tents anymore for their game, right? So it's a little bit survival of the fittest, a little bit, Hunger Games, a little bit. What's the Lord of the Flies? Thank you. Yeah.
Because that's such a fun game.
Yeah, really fun game that they play.
But were you thinking about their behavior paralleling the adults, or was your intention just to write that?
In fact, yes. And I really thought of them as a kind of microcosm of what's going on with the adults. And because there's bullying going on between the kids, even the littler kids, there's factions forming, there's issues of race, there's, huge issues of class, and impoverishment and loss, right? Because some of these kids have lost their parents. And so that kind of, thinking about the different sorts of communities, the different kinds of cruelty and kindness that kids can have versus parents. I think that, and I've always written multiple point of view novels. I often start out saying this is going to be one person's point of view, and then it just kind of explodes. That's probably part of why, I grew up reading a lot of 19th century novels, Dickens and so on. So I love that kind of zooming in to one little person's life, zooming back out, seeing other people moving in the same world, but getting in their heads.
Well, going back to, I'm sorry, is it Kirsten?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Was she the one that gave you the map of the organizations that's
No, that was my idea. Well, it was all my idea. No, the whole thing. So this is, if you've read it, so I've got this, one of the challenges in writing a book like this is, this is about one family's story, right? Daphne and her kids. And yet this massive story of climate change, it's global, right? It's affecting everyone in different ways. And this huge hurricane that comes through, it has a long tail, as one of the characters says. It fundamentally changes the nation in a lot of ways. And so I was thinking, how can I tell this one small story without a bunch of information dump, right? Without telling you, having a character just kind of recite to you all these other ways the hurricane affected the nation or in the globe. So I decided to kind of insert this short excerpts from this, what's called a digital humanities project called The Great Displacement, a digital chronicle of the lunar migration. And you find out later in the book who put this together, but it's kind of looking back on the disaster retrospectively. You have first-person testimonials, like from the governor of Florida or the meteorologist who first announced the Category 6 hurricane on screen, a lot of other people. But then you also have charts and maps. You have a map of all the different shelters. You have a little diagram that tells you all the different organizations that were involved in serving the displaced populations. You have maps that tell you where everybody went afterwards. And that the idea, the conceit, is that when you get an audio recording, you can click on the button. And a lot of people have asked, so many people have asked me, where's the real website? I tried to find it. I wanted to listen to them. I said, well, it's not, it's a novel. It's fake. But it was a way of getting those big stories in to a very small area, into a very small story about a family, and putting those in dialogue with each other.
I was just astonished at the number of organizations and the specialties that each of them had, and thinking, all of these people individually do great work, but when you have this, with this kind of web, does it become a community that's not working because everybody's trying to help, but everybody's, like, I'm going to give you a pallet of water, but this person over here is still thirsty.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But, where do you get all those meals? How do the kids start going to school again? Right. How do we, and where does the food come from? Which was a big one, like meals ready to eat, MREs, and Kirsten did give me that idea about the ones from Norway being really delicious because they have the smoked salmon in them, right? But the U.S. Army ones being disgusting. And that, that's very real. People complaining about the quality of the food when they're being given food, they just don't have anything. They're used to eating what they want, and suddenly they can't. And so organizations, there's so much bureaucracy to disaster relief. It's just kind of astonishing. And these organizations are competing for resources. They're competing for philanthropy. And for attention, for transportation. And, at one point, Rain says, how awful it is, working in some refugee camps around the world where, you go in a refugee camp in the morning to help as best you can. You watch 5 kids die. Then you go back to your hotel in town and go to the bar and have a big meal at the bar, right? And it's that kind of disjunction, those psychological, but you have to stay healthy because you're trying to help people, right? So it's just such a kind of it has devastating effects on relief workers as well. That's one of the things I wanted to convey with Rain, who's fighting with her bureaucracy, fighting with other bureaucracies, and just trying to keep everybody alive and okay.
Well, as an outsider to the disaster relief, but having done some research, excuse me, did you see any areas that you thought, boy, that's a blind spot, a mile wide? Anything that you said or felt like you could go back to Kirsten and say, have you guys thought about this?
Well, actually, yes, because, one of the things I talked to her about, and actually not so much her, but somebody she set me up with in FEMA, was, what about, what if you had, okay, take the biggest shelter that you've ever seen for people evacuating. What would that be? That would be the Superdome in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, which I think at one point 4,000 people were in there. I said, so how would you, if you had to build that, what would you do? And he just kind of scratched his head and he said, well, we have ideas for housing and so on. And I said, okay, but what if 1 million or 2 million people were permanently displaced from their homes? And he said, well, we don't see that happening. We've got 10, 20,000 at a time. That's a lot. We can handle that. I said, no. But what if, let's just say Miami were destroyed, right, in a huge hurricane? That's predicted at some point. What would you do? And he just said, well, and it was like deer in headlights. And this is someone from FEMA who'd been working in disaster relief for 20 years. So this quantity of things was what, the failure to plan for the quantity of housing needed, for the quantity and movement of food at this scale, is that failure is kind of mind-boggling to me because I'm a medievalist. I don't know anything about any of this, right? So it was really, really harrowing, I think, to hear that. And just, you wonder, what else aren't we prepared for?
So if you had the opportunity, whose hands would you put this book into and make it required reading?
Oh my goodness. Well, I haven't thought about that. I mean, I would, I think I suppose the dream would be to get this in the hands of, people who have the power to make policy about climate change, I guess, and get a real hooky narrative, a suspenseful narrative that make people read and think in a different way. But a novel is not, it's not an op-ed. It's not like this is not a policy document. It's a work of fiction. It's a work of imagination. And it's, you just never know where a reading experience is going to take somebody, right? Maybe, Kirsten's classes have been reading this for a number of Baton School classes have been reading this the last couple of years. And I've gotten a lot of energy from students who come and ask me about it and say, well, how do I get into Doctors Without Borders? And I said, well, you have to talk to Kirsten. You probably want to go to medical school, but you also want to talk to Kirsten about that, because I don't know. So that kind of thing, where and I do know, I don't know so much about this one, but the Gifted School, a lot of my friends who read it said, God, it made me, I almost recognized myself in it. And it really made me kind of rethink how I, think about my ambition for my kids. And I said, it almost made you think you are in it. But it made me rethink too about my own, somewhat psychotic approach to my kids. And,
both of whom are
so, you just never know where a novel's going to go. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I was hoping that we have people out here who also have questions. We have Desiree and Allison have microphones, and so if you have a question for Bruce, raise your hand. And
I'm gonna let Allison give the microphone to you because she's coming over there. Here she is. She'll pass it down to you, right on your left. Right.
Is this on? Yes.
Yep.
Hi, here I am. Okay.
Over here.
it's right
Here.
Right here.
This is not a question, it's a commercial. And what I'm saying is Dr. Holsinger has a wonderful Coursera course that I took about 10 years ago, but I think it's still going on. It's on historical fiction. And I, for one, as much as I enjoyed Displacement, I'm kind of sorry you've left the fold of historical fiction.
Well, thank you so much. That's nice of you to say. So there's a course called Plagues, Witches, and War, The Worlds of Historical Fiction. And it was a MOOC. Do you remember MOOCs? A massive open online course. So I taught that, over 10 years ago. And And that I think by this point, 100,000 people have taken it. Absolutely crazy. But I think it's free. I think you could still take it free. But yeah, that was quite the adventure. We had a number of authors down to UVA to teach a seminar a senior seminar with 15 UVA students on grounds, but we filmed our sessions and posted them with the authors, and then participants in the online course could ask questions of the authors and interact in different ways. It was a blast. Thank you for saying something. And please, it's Bruce. Yeah.
Have one down front.
Yeah. Hang on. Got the mic for you.
I can speak up. Hi, I didn't know you were a medievalist, but as soon as that was introduced, I immediately thought about the circles of hell and Dante. And I wondered how much correlation, I mean, do you as a professional scholar, as a scholar of times gone by, yet maybe not gone by, recognize yourself in this book as that type of scholar? Or is it going back to the lobes that you spoke about earlier, how differently you need to express your creativity? Am I making myself clear?
Yeah,
So if you read this and you were a medieval scholar, would you recognize yourself? And did Dante's Inferno have any influence on the very many circles of hell that all these people went through?
All right, I will say that the answer to question 2 is definitely no, at least not consciously. But now I'm wondering, like, do I have Malabulgia in here? Do I have, I'm thinking about all the ways Dante punishes sinners. But no, I don't think so. But God, what a question. But there are a few little medieval touches in here. I think there's one, I think I left it in here towards the end where I won't tell you who it is, but people are talking about resilience. The ways that the disaster forced people into finding resilience and hope in different ways. How to account for this variety, these differences? The Middle Ages gave us the notion of the florilegium, a collection of written extracts, literally a gathering of flowers, that may be perused, enjoyed, admired, or ignored at the reader's pleasure. This botanical metaphor is appropriate for a genre such as a digital chronicle, with its many voices unbound by a single dominant narrative. Or think of this project as the project of the Great Displacement, this digital project that you get. Or think of this project as a huge tree. Every leaf is someone's unique story, every stem and twig connected to the stories of others, and ultimately to the one great story that we're all living together. Those involved in creating this project had to choose which leaves and petals to feature and which branches to prune. So in other words, that image of the tree, the vineyard of the text, the florilegium, the leaves of a book like the leaves of a tree, those are kind of medieval. My appreciation for story, I think, is very much shaped by my profession as a medievalist and thinking about all the different kinds of stories there are, the ways they're compiled, put together, like in the Canterbury Tales, 1001 Nights, Boccaccio's Decameron, which is about 100 stories that people tell on the outskirts of Florence when they're fleeing a catastrophe, right? So that is, So now that I'm now answering the first part of your question, but I think with an emphatic yes, which I wouldn't have thought before you asked it. Back here, yeah.
My question isn't quite as intellectual, more just practical. This came up in our discussion in book club. It's regarding.
Now, do I get a recording of that? No.
It's regarding Daphne's sculpture, the Sentinel, that she ends up gifting to Rain. One of our big questions was, what is the size of it?
I'm sorry, say that again.
The sculpture that Daphne had made, the Sentinel, right? That she gives to Rain. We were curious about the size of it.
I was thinking about like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be hard to carry, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It forced the discussion of like, how does she transport it? And clearly that's what she values and all. Thank you.
Yeah.
But of course, it also goes along with Rain's aesthetic.
Yeah.
With her desire for decoration and beauty.
Yes, and beauty and the gift of beauty, right? And Another bit of research I did, hands-on research, is I took some classes in ceramics, in clay, and also learned how to make clay out of clay soil. And it's not that I got good at it, but it's one of those, I wanted to feel it, I wanted to smell it, taste it.
Well, you really are committed to it. We have a question down here.
Method writing. Yeah.
One of the things that I found that made the book so compelling, but also so disturbing, was how plausible it seemed. Like, I think we could all really see this, how this could unfold in this way. The library was giving out extra copies that they had, and I got one for my 24-year-old daughter, who is already so anxious about climate change. And I've got to say, I don't know if I want to give it to her. And I'm curious, the students that you teach, your own son, you mentioned, what their reaction has been. Has this just created even more worry and anxiety over climate change?
There was this piece in the New York Times, I think just this morning, about climate cafes. Did anybody see this? It's about these community groups that are forming all over the country, probably all over the world, to talk about our fear of climate change. And so I've talked to one of my sons is very attuned to it, and the other is not so attuned to it. And I don't know, because here's the truth about the plausibility is there will certainly be something like this that happens. Who knows? It's already happening in some places in the next 10, 15 years. But, like one of the points of the book, you see it later in the book, is, the story starts to fade. That hurricane happened a few months ago, right? Things move on. They're rebuilding. It ends up not on the front pages anymore, right? And so the experience of climate catastrophe it feels very kind of fragmentary and pointillist almost. It's going to be happening for, there may be more awful air that we have to breathe this summer because of forest fires in Canada, right? And New Yorkers may have to wear masks for a big part of the summer. Or there may be, an absolutely catastrophic hurricane that destroys Charleston, South Carolina, in 3 months, right? But there may be nothing. There may be no really catastrophic hurricanes for the next 10 years, right? So the unpredictability, the unknowability is almost as terrifying as knowing what might be coming, right? So I have no answer to your question. My solution is to write and read and teach and love and make art, right? And vote and give money when I can.
But I think one of the strong things that you just read about was resilience. Mm-hmm. And so practicing resilience in the small things may help with the big things.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here. I was struck by Daphne's isolation. She lived in, Michigan for all those years, and then she lived in Florida. She has no family. She has no friendships. She has nobody, Pilar, but that's also economic. She has nobody she can call.
She's a recent move to Miami.
But she's been in her prior community, none of these long-term relationships with other people. And I was wondering if this is, it certainly made it convenient for her situation, but is this a commentary on your part on adult human relationships and connection with other people? Some of the other people in the shelter had, it was a friend or a cousin or somebody who eventually found them a place, and she didn't have any of that. And
and you're exactly right. And I may have gone too far with that. I've wondered a number of times, because it's not the first time I've gotten that question. And part of it was initially, it was just kind of a practicality. Raise your hand if you have anyone's phone number memorized that's not like a member of your immediate family, right? I don't know any of my friends' phone numbers the way I did 20 years ago. And so that was just, how's she going to get in touch with them? Well, she could pull over and use somebody else's phone to look them up and maybe call them or whatever. But there's so there was that part of it, but then there was also just, the deaths of her parents way before the novel begins, and just this, sense of a kind of solitary artist working in a kind of isolation. But so it's a really good question. Probably something, I wish I'd had you read the manuscript before my final revision.
Is some down here?
Well, this is another question really about the construction of the book, because at the end, and I'm a reader that likes the loose ends tied up, so we learn about the dog, and we learn about the car.
Now,
but
no spoilers, right?
Well, those would be things I think you might not find out about. But I was left hungry for more about Mia and Oliver and the effects that they had, because unless I missed it, and I'm legally blind, so I listened to the audiobook, but those ends don't seem to be, we know that Gavin becomes a teacher and she continues to sculpt, but what happens to those kids?
Yeah, well, sequel, right? When you write from all those points of view, and Daphne has this moment of Mia has this moment of kindness at the end in the stadium, right? And there's, so, and it's Luz whose loose end I was more interested in tying up. And I love the mystery of character. I love not really knowing where people go. I don't, a nice pat ending. I want that in some ways, but it's never going to be complete when you have so many characters, right? So, who knows? And they're also so young, so who knows where they're going to go, right? Leaving that open for children is, they'll choose their paths. And
we have a couple over here. Oh, sorry, I didn't see.
Thank you for writing the book and being here. Really enjoyed it. The thing that struck me was the fragility of our electronics in our lives now, and it seems to me that some of the heroes of the book were the ceramics and the books. Were you trying to display an anti-technology type of? And the other question is, what is uterine vellum?
Does that appear in the Displacements?
I didn't hear what.
What is uterine vellum? What made you ask that question? You have to tell me. Oh, okay, all right. I'll explain. Let me answer the first one first. I can't even now remember the first question.
Technology or no?
Yeah, so no, it's not an anti-technology book, but it is there is this transition that Daphne goes through once her kids are off the phones, right? And that's, it's one of those things that you think, okay, your phone plan runs out. You can't pay your phone plan anymore. So you don't have a phone. Your kids don't have a phone. That's a benefit in some ways, right? That's going to change your life. It's going to make it a huge pain in the ass, right? But it's also going to be wonderful in a way. And so, so I was idealizing that maybe. But the objects, the art, the sculpture, the books that become important to people, there is this kind of analog life that's lived in this camp. And I really wanted to explore that and the implications of that, what that would look like, and how that might change people's disposition towards things, right? And I'm always like, I'm one of those people who just looks at my screen time and just blanches with horror. And I desperately want to give things up. I want my kids to give things up. But, I have no spine. So how do I do it? How do I make that happen? So I think we're all in this, a lot of us are in this bind.
And the uterine vellum?
Oh, right, I have to answer that question. All right, so, so for a long time I've been obsessed with this material called parchment, which is you might think you know what parchment is, like parchment paper that you cook with, but the real parchment is a writing surface made out of the skins of animals. And that's what almost all of medieval literature is written on. And there's millions and millions of pieces of it that survive in the world's archives. So my last nonfiction book was about parchment, which I've been obsessed with for many, many years. And uterine vellum is this phrase for a really, really tissue-thin, fine kind of parchment that was used for these really fine Bibles in the Middle Ages. And for a long, long time, people thought that, or people claimed that it came from the skins of stillborn calves or calves that were still in utero when the mother died. And I worked with a team of scientists to sample the skins, the biomolecular content of a ton of skins and analyze it. So we'll talk about that next year. If you have any questions about that, happy to answer.
Okay, we had a couple over here.
Hi, thank you, Bruce, for writing this book. It was a thriller for me, so I think you can call that a genre. But I wanted to follow up a little bit on the discussion about the community of people and, you know, what happens later. I was really concerned about Luce, of course, you know, what happens to her and her brother. But did you do any follow-up or research about what happened after Katrina, kind of the displacements and the returns? Is there any lessons learned through Katrina that you kind of referenced in the book or incorporated in the book?
Well, the main thing I reference in the book is lessons not learned, because that is what people will tell you who work in not so much in FEMA, but like in the Red Cross and other kind of ancillary organizations that work with FEMA. Is like we had Katrina, and even now, if you had suddenly 20,000 people displaced from New Orleans, there wouldn't be enough temporary housing for them, which I think is appalling, right? That there's not the level of resources. We don't have a whole bunch of tents that are, we do, but we don't have enough. We don't have tens, hundreds of thousands, right? And it's one of those things, out of sight, out of mind, that Katrina maybe should have taught us, right? And there were so many controversies about housing after Katrina. There was these FEMA trailers that were full of arsenic in the walls, right, in the plumbing systems, and there's all this kind of toxic stuff that came out of the housing projects that those NGOs did. So if anything, it's lessons unlearned, which is so often the case with government bureaucracies, right?
So other than perhaps reading contracts before you sign them, are there other things in your literary career you might have done differently?
We were talking about one. Yeah, right. What were we talking about before about?
The language in the Gower book.
Yeah, somebody, I forget who it was. One of the people helping with tech, right, came in. What is your name again? Kristen, right? Another Kristen, yeah. In the green room, we were talking about, she had read A Burnable Book, my first novel, and she said, yeah, I really loved it. I had to look up a lot of words. And I thought, you know what, I don't want, and a lot of people have said that to me about my historical novels. I don't want people to have to sit there with a dictionary while they're reading my supposedly suspenseful stories, right? So, in any historical novel, you're gonna have things that people have to look up and probably want to look up. That's part of the pleasure of reading historical fiction. I'm sure those who read it will agree. But you also want a compelling story that keeps you turning the pages. So that's one mistake. Another big mistake was beginning my second novel, The Invention of Fire, in a sewer, which I think turned a lot of people off.
You didn't start writing it in the sewer.
No, I did not.
The scene was in the sewer.
I had a writing residency in a sewer. No, the novel starts in a sewer, and a lot of people told me, at least a dozen, said, I just couldn't keep reading it after that. I thought, really? Okay, so that taught me I did not start my next novel in a sewer.
Well, I'm going to finish up by sharing with you something that I was talking with a couple of people here. One said that she read this book and it was the longest day because she had to read the whole thing all the way through and didn't finish until 4 a.m.
That's what I want to hear.
The other, her friend said that she didn't want it to end, and so she could only read it a little piece at a time.
Oh, I love hearing stuff like that.
That's the kind of impact you had on readers. Oh. So let's all give Bruce Holsinger a hand.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.